Mr. Clark's back. Time to take a look at 12.4 topic, the Enlightenment, sometimes remembered as the Age of Reason. As we go through, just make sure you pay close attention to some of the key ideas coming out of the Enlightenment as it's going to provide the foundation for a lot of modern day revolutions. So our objectives for today, we're going to see how science and the scientific revolution kind of helped to spark the Enlightenment. One of the reasons why we often study the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment back to back is because they kind of build upon each other, the general ideas and how people began to think in a different fashion. We're going to specifically look at some of the different political philosophies of Hobbes, Locke, Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Rousseau. We'll summarize economic ideas of people like Adam Smith. We'll describe how the Enlightenment ideas spread and impacted the arts. And we'll begin to take a look at, and that'll be kind of the next topic we'll look at as we move forward from the Enlightenment, are the enlightened despots, the leaders who kind of emerged during this period of time in history. So you can see here the key link between the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. So when you look here at number one, success in science convinced many educated Europeans of the power of human reason. The question is, how did an emphasis on human reason lead to developments in other areas of life? Well, an emphasis on reason was applied to other areas of society, began to convince philosophers that social, economic, and political problems could and should be solved through the use of reason and natural law. So instead of, once again, just sitting back and accepting, day in and day out the same repetitive results, they began to think things out and kind of problem solve, something that we as educators and you as students really want to see and facilitate even in our own classroom. So when you look at the Enlightenment, it's also known, as we mentioned in our intro, the Age of Reason. And once again, just like the Renaissance or the Middle Ages or the Scientific Revolution, they don't start on a Monday and on a specific date and end on a Wednesday and another specific date. So from a general time perspective, we're looking at the 1600s and 1700s. Different parts of the world kind of embrace it at different points in time. So we had new thoughts on individual rights, freedoms, and how the government should develop. These new ideas would help to spark revolutions as we move forward in history, and we will look at some of these revolutions as we move forward throughout the school year. All right, so one of the first people we'll take a look at now is Thomas Hobbes. What did Hobbes mean when he advocated a social contract? Well, he advocated a social contract in that an agreement where citizens often would give up some of their individual rights and freedoms for an organized and a chaos-free society. So he argued that sometimes you surrender these rights to the government. In return, the government provides protection and a better life for you. He wrote the book Leviathan, and it's kind of a little political cartoon kind of based on his book. Kind of the enlightened despot kind of looking over his subjects. Next, we'll look at John Locke. He proposed that if a government fails in its obligations, the people have the right to overthrow their government. Question, what are some of the obligations you believe a government owes to its people? So it's kind of a general and open statement here. Often people mention the obligation of the government to protect the natural rights of the citizens, life, liberty, and property. In fact, I'll add that in there. Life, liberty, and property. So although we're not directly together at this moment, kind of thinking through some of these things here, sometimes I'll add this in there for you. Protection against foreign enemies, that means you're free from being basically invaded on a regular basis, which is really problematic during, let's say, the 1500s and 1600s in European society, often just along coastal areas. Vikings and other groups just kind of come in and pillage the people. Equality under the law, once again, this is something that one could argue that we don't really even have this in a modern day society here in the 2020s. John Locke, of course, being a philosopher who provided the key, John Locke provided the key for many future revolutions. See what I did there? 5, how did Locke's ideas impact the American colonies? Well, American colonists began demanding equal rights in the later 1700s. They wanted representation. You may even remember back to your previous studies of the American Revolutionary War. One of the rallying cries for the American colonists, no representation uh, uh, without representation. So we look at representation. That's basically what they wanted. The American colonists, representation in Parliament. So I messed up that rallying cry there. No taxation without representation being the rallying cry for the American colonists. Because what they were arguing was that the Parliament was passing taxes on the American colonists, and they didn't have representation in Parliament to kind of voice their opinion as to whether or not they wanted to be taxed. So that kind of seems like a fair complaint. Here's a quote from Locke: "Every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has a right to but himself." So basically, a little bit of convoluted English during that period of time, Old English. But basically, what Locke is saying is that your property must be protected. Next, which of the Enlightenment thinkers described in the Enlightenment had the greatest impact on the structure of the American government? If we look at the Enlightenment thinker who had the greatest impact on the actual structure of the American government, the Baron de Montesquieu. It was his ideas. He came up with the ideas of separation of powers and checks and balances, 3 branches of the American government: executive, legislative, and judicial. He believed are designed to kind of keep each other in check. So I'm just going to enlarge the image for a moment here. So if we look at the structure of the American government, we have the legislative branch. This is in America is the Congress, which is made up of the upper house, or the more powerful house, the Senate. Those who serve in the Senate serve 6-year terms, and the House of Representatives, those are 2-year terms. There's 2 senators per state for a total of 100 in the Senate. The House of Reps is based on population with a total of 435 members in the House of Reps from the 50 states. Then you have 3 additional representatives who are from different areas, but are not necessarily from a particular state. The executive branch, the president, vice president, and the cabinet, they're the executive. They carry out the laws. The judicial branch interprets a law. So basically, if a law gets passed by Congress, then the president, the executive branch, can sign it into law or veto it. If it's signed into law, then the judicial branch can interpret whether or not that law was constitutional or not. When you see the term philosophe, it's just the French term for a philosopher, the French philosophe Voltaire. He said, "I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to death your right to say it." What was he advocating for with this quote? And of course, that is freedom of speech, something we enjoy here in the United States. When you look at the different things that Voltaire fought against, corrupt officials in government, in France in particular, and when we'll look at the French Revolution, you'll see some of the corruption that was inherent in France during that period of time in history. When you look at this period of time in French history, you had a very unfair system where the wealthiest small percent of the French population paid 0 taxes, and all the poor and the middle-class citizens paid all the taxes, basically. So we'll see how that really didn't work out well. It's because of corruption officials. Idle aristocrats who really didn't do anything to help out. Religious prejudice, the slave trade. These are all things that Voltaire spoke out against. Unfortunately, his impact on the slave trade was not that great. Right? Number 9, Denis Diderot wanted his 28-volume encyclopedia to change the general way of thinking. What would Diderot think of modern-day versions that solicit user-generated entries like Wikipedia? Do such versions undermine or support his original purpose in creating the encyclopedia? So you can look at the comparison of a academic encyclopedia system that Diderot came up with versus that of the modern day citizens who edit out Wikipedia. He might be pleased, Diderot, that people are taking time to think about broad issues themselves and making their own opinions. On the other hand, it could undermine it as users are not leading thinkers. And of course, Diderot was a leading thinker of his time. And anyone can edit entries and provide what could be amounts of inaccurate information, which is why Wikipedia is not something that's permissible. You cannot use that as, let's say, a source for a paper or a project in class. You might support it as modern versions are more democratic, allowing for many, many people to contribute all at one point in time. So depending upon the perspective that you kind of come from, you might either be in favor of or against a edited out version of an encyclopedia. Explaining an argument, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He argued in the social contract, pictured down the bottom here, that the unequal distribution of property was fundamental to corrupting the basic goodness of people in their natural state. Why might people be corrupted by unequal distribution of property? So his argument was that those with property and the means to make a living would always be better off than those who did not have property. So what he was really advocating for was more equity within the government and within the citizenry. (11) What rights did women have during the Enlightenment? The Enlightenment ideas of freedom and equality did not yet apply to women. They were pretty much ignored, not just during this period of time in history, but well into the 20th century. For women, their rights were limited to the areas of home and family. So quite unfortunate, but nonetheless part of history. (12) What is laissez-faire economics? Well, first of all, laissez-faire, you should know, is a French term for hands-off. When you look at laissez-faire, it's really the idea that the government should not interfere in anything within society, kind of take a step back. So it advocates basically what we have today in our own country, a capitalistic or free market economy, which allows businesses to operate with little or no government interference. Alternatively known as capitalism, is the foundation of our modern American economy. Scottish economist Adam Smith, he advocated these basic principles in his book entitled The Wealth of Nations. (13) What are two differences between physiocrats and mercantilists? Mercantilists favored government regulation, while physiocrats opposed government regulation. Mercantilists believed in building wealth through trade, while physiocrats believed in building wealth through land productivity. 14 lists 3 ways the Enlightenment ideas spread during the 1700s. So you think about 1700s, obviously we're not text messaging or YouTube sharing information. Pamphlets would be a common way to get information out. Saloons or salons. A salon would be a place for academic discussion and discourse where you can basically talk back and forth on big issues, sip a cup of tea or maybe have an adult beverage. Social critiques disguised as fiction. You see how art and literature were impacted by the Enlightenment. Explain why philosophers criticize Rococo art. Well, the main reason they didn't like it is it did not depict reality. Happy service and idyllic landscapes were not reflective of the realities of life and did not reflect the goal for a just society. So basically, they were basically misrepresenting the way life was at that time. Philosophers wanted things to be more accurate, an accurate reflection of the difficult times that we had. 16, how did the middle class influence the arts, literature, and music of the period? They liked straightforward language, music, and art, kind of very much the matter of fact, very plain in nature. (17) The enlightened despots were absolute rulers who used their power to bring about political and social change. Who might object to the political and social change of an enlightened despot? The nobility might object because the changes would threaten their power and place in society. The church might object to any reforms that threaten their doctrine or power over the people. Here are some examples of some of the enlightened despots of the time. You had King George III of England, Louis XVI of France. You have Catherine the Great of Russia. Okay, number 18. What is one reform that all three enlightened despots enacted? Rephrasing the question there. How do you believe that reform is a universal theme amongst the absolute rulers? Extending religious tolerance, which gave major goals of enlightenment was a major goal of enlightenment thinkers. They tended to reduce the power of established churches. So if you're an enlightened despot, you would want the power to be concentrated within you and your kingdom, opposed to that of the church. And finally, the lesson reflection: why was the Enlightenment such a consequential and significant period of time in history? For one, it sparked new ways of thinking that challenged long-standing societal norms. It motivated citizens to stand up for their rights. It led to the French and American revolutions, not in that order, long-standing principles of the modern American government. So this kind of gives you a little introduction into the Enlightenment thoughts and even the absolute monarchs, these enlightened despots here. We're going to see how their kingdoms and their reign will be impacted by the Enlightenment as we continue to move forward in history. So hopefully you enjoyed our discussion of the Enlightenment. Hopefully you are more enlightened on the ideas of the Enlightenment thinkers. And until next time, Mr. Clark is out.